Okay, so the second ransom note in the Nancy Guthrie case has finally made it into the public. Not paraphrased, not a vague summary from an anonymous source. The actual words. And since I read them, I haven't been able to stop thinking about one specific phrase in that note. She is buried with nature now. I'm going to spend this whole video on that phrase, and on everything around it, because I think most of the analysis that's been circulating is missing the central point, and the central point is disturbing in a way that goes beyond the obvious. For anyone who hasn't been following this case from the beginning, Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the co-anchor of the Today Show. In the early hours of February 1st, 2026, she was taken from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. Blood was found on her front porch. Her front door showed signs of forced entry. A doorbell camera captured a masked, armed man outside her home that night. She was in her pajamas, no shoes, no medication. That was 144 days ago. In the days after she disappeared, ransom notes started arriving at media outlets. 3 went to TMZ, to a local Tucson station, and to another Arizona news organization. Most were fake, opportunists trying to extract money from a grieving family during a national news story. But 2 of them, investigators now believe, were likely real, sent from the same IP address, from the same person or group. The first note arrived February 2nd, one day after Nancy disappeared. It said she was safe but scared. It demanded $4 million in Bitcoin. It set a deadline, threatened to raise the price to $6 million if that deadline was missed, and said if neither was met, she would be killed. But it also contained something else. Details about Nancy's home that had never been made public. The specific location of an Apple Watch in her bedroom. A broken light on the back porch. The second note arrived 4 days later, on February 6th. It didn't ask for money. It said she was dead. Here's the exact language of that second note, as reported by people who actually had eyes on it. We never intended to hurt her in all of this. She perished shortly after she was taken. She is buried with nature now. Nothing you could have done could have changed the outcome. We are truly sorry. Read that back slowly, because every single line is doing something specific, and it's worth understanding what. We never intended to hurt her. That's a statement of intent, or claimed intent. They're separating themselves from the violence of the act. We took her. We didn't mean to hurt her. There's a distinction being drawn there that clearly matters to whoever wrote this. She perished, not died, not passed away, which is the phrase a native English speaker reaches for. Perished. That's a word you find in translation. It's what a non-native speaker chooses when they're reaching for something that means death but sounds less final, less brutal. A hostage negotiator who's been on this case pointed this out and said, "What career criminal uses the word perished? Nobody who grew up speaking English as their first language writes it that way." She is buried with nature now. This is the one I keep coming back to. Because this isn't translation awkwardness. This is a choice. They could have said we buried her. They could have said her body is in the desert. Instead, they chose language that sounds almost like a religious ceremony. Something intentionally soft, something that was supposed to be comforting. A former FBI agent who analyzed this specific phrase for Newsweek said something that stuck with me. She said they didn't say they threw her in the ground or discarded her in the desert. The word choice shows an attempt to make it sound gentle. And she said in her experience, that kind of softening language, that almost poetic framing, points to someone who had genuine empathy for this family. Someone who was disturbed by what happened. Someone who was in some way trying to make it easier for the people receiving that note. Nothing you could have done could have changed the outcome. That sentence exists to remove guilt from Savannah and her siblings. It's saying, this wasn't your fault. You couldn't have stopped this. Which is an incredibly specific thing to say if you're just a kidnapper trying to collect money. You don't comfort your marks. You don't try to make grieving family members feel better about their inability to save their mother. We are truly sorry. And then an apology. Not a demand, not leverage, an apology. No request for money, no threat, no instructions. Just a note that says, she's dead, she didn't suffer the way you might fear she did. We put her somewhere connected to the natural world, and we're sorry. Who writes that? I want to be careful here because there are 2 very different ways to read this note, and I think both deserve to be taken seriously. Reading 1. The note is genuine. The people who took Nancy Guthrie planned a kidnapping for money. They scouted her house, they knew about the Apple Watch, they knew about the broken porch light. They sent the first note with specific proof of inside knowledge to establish credibility. Then something went wrong very quickly. An 84-year-old woman in fragile health, dependent on medication she didn't have, taken in the dead of night in February in Arizona. She may have fallen during the abduction. There are reports of blood drops inside the house as well as outside, consistent with bleeding that started in the bedroom. She may have gone into shock. She may have had a cardiac event. Whatever happened, she was dead within days of being taken, and the people who took her panicked. The plan was gone, the money was gone, and someone in that group, someone who apparently had more empathy than the man who beat an 84-year-old woman on her own porch, sat down and wrote a note trying to explain that it wasn't supposed to go this way. Reading 2. The note is manipulation. Someone watched the coverage of this case and decided to construct a note that would feel authentic, give the family closure, and stop the active search by suggesting Nancy is already dead. The language was carefully crafted to seem like it's from someone with inside knowledge, even if it isn't. The softness and the apology are designed to disarm, not to comfort. The problem with reading 2 is the IP address. Investigators believe this note came from the same IP as the first note, the one that accurately described the Apple Watch and the broken porch light. Those details were never public. A faker would have to have had real access to that information, which means either this is genuine or the same person who had inside knowledge of the house sent both notes, for reasons we don't fully understand yet. Investigators, for what it's worth, are treating both notes as potentially credible. There's a detail from this case that came out this week that I think is being completely underreported. A retired homicide detective named Chris McDonough, 90% case resolution rate over 25 years in law enforcement, now runs a cold case foundation. Just spent 7 days in Tucson personally investigating this case. And he came back with something nobody has really dug into. Nancy's daughter Annie, Savannah's sister, has a jewelry workshop in Tucson. That workshop is located in an area of the city described as a high fentanyl zone, high crime area. And Annie is connected to a foundation in that same area that supports people who have recently been released from prison, helping them reintegrate through job applications and career assistance. Here's why that matters. The detective pointed out something that is basic investigative work but important. Nancy Guthrie was what investigators call a very low-risk victim. She was sleeping in her own home, in a neighborhood she'd lived in for 50 years, where nothing bad had ever happened to her. Statistically, when someone that low risk becomes a target, it almost always means there was a specific contact point, a moment when the perpetrator crossed paths with the victim or someone connected to the victim, and identified her as a target. His theory is that someone connected to Annie's work with that foundation, either a recently released inmate, or someone who overheard a conversation in that area, or someone who worked near Annie's workshop, may have at some point learned that Annie's sister was Savannah Guthrie, the Today Show host. And from there, the math was simple. Savannah Guthrie equals money. Savannah Guthrie's elderly mother, living alone in a neighborhood she's been in for 50 years, is a target. Is that definitive? No. Worth pursuing? The detective thinks absolutely yes. And he said something that genuinely troubled me. He reached out to the Tucson Police Department to ask if Pima County Sheriff's Department, the lead agency on this case, had connected with their street teams, their informants, the people on the ground in high-crime areas who hear things. The answer he got back was no. 144 days into this investigation, and the two law enforcement agencies responsible for solving it had apparently still not coordinated on that basic street-level intelligence gathering. He also noted that there are 3 Walmart stores within 2 miles of Annie's workshop. The backpack the porch guy was wearing is an Ozark Trail Hiker pack, a Walmart brand. The clothing and mask were also consistent with Walmart purchases. Probably a coincidence. But in an investigation with almost no confirmed leads 5 months in, coincidences are worth at least looking at. There's a thread in this case I want to pull on because I don't think it's gotten enough attention, and it connects directly to the language of that second note. The retired hostage negotiator who analyzed the first note said it was a complete anomaly in terms of how real kidnappings for ransom actually work. Real kidnapping operations, the kind run by organized criminal groups who do this for a living, follow a pretty predictable pattern. You contact the family directly, quietly, and you start negotiating. You do not send notes to 3 different media organizations on day 1. You do not immediately threaten to kill the hostage in the first communication. You do not set escalating payment deadlines in a public note. Every single one of those things is backwards from how actual ransom cases operate. What it looks like, to people who have spent careers in this field, is something improvised. Something where the planning stopped at the abduction and never really extended to what happens after. Someone who thought hard about how to get Nancy out of that house and almost nothing about what to do once they had her. And that fits with the second note. If you had a sophisticated operation with real infrastructure, you wouldn't send an apology note to a TV station. You'd cut your losses and disappear. The fact that someone took the time to write that note, that specific, careful, almost poetic note, suggests someone who wasn't a professional criminal in any meaningful sense. Someone genuinely rattled by what happened, genuinely sorry in some form, and genuinely trying to communicate that to a family they knew was watching the news. Nothing you could have done could have changed the outcome. That's not a line from a career criminal's playbook. That's a line from someone trying to process guilt. Let's talk about the TMZ thread, because it's one of the stranger subplots in this case. Harvey Levin at TMZ was one of the original recipients of the first ransom note back in February. He and TMZ have been working with the FBI on this case since then. And in the last week, Harvey has been in the middle of a public back and forth about exactly what the notes he received said versus what other outlets have been reporting. Here's what he's confirmed. The note TMZ received in February said Nancy was safe but scared. It demanded $4 million with escalating deadlines and a threat to kill her. TMZ did not receive a note saying Nancy was dead or buried with nature. That second note went to a different outlet. But TMZ did receive something else, a separate series of communications, separate from the original notes, from someone who claims to know who did this and where Nancy is buried, and who is willing to sell that information. Harvey described this person as coming at him repeatedly, suggesting they'd exchange the information for money. The FBI has been looking at those communications, Harvey said, and they believe, based on the linguistics and writing style, that the person who sent them may be a woman. Not the person who wrote the original ransom notes, a different person entirely. Someone who wasn't directly involved in the abduction, but who apparently knows people who were. Think about what that means. If true, it suggests this wasn't a two-person job. There are people in someone's orbit who know what happened. People who weren't on that porch but who heard things afterward. And at least one of them is apparently trying to figure out how to monetize what they know without fully committing to turning someone in. The FBI reward for information leading to arrest and conviction is $100,000. The Guthrie family's reward is $1 million. $1.1 million total for information that solves this case. And someone apparently has that information and is still negotiating. Savannah Guthrie has been doing something almost impossible for 5 months. She has been going to work. She's been on national television, live, 5 days a week, often smiling, talking about news stories that have nothing to do with the fact that her 84-year-old mother is missing and probably dead. On June 24th, she broke her silence on air about the latest developments, said she had no comment on the specific news story about the notes. And then she said this, that her family lives in agony every day, that her children live in this, that her siblings live in this, that behind the smile she brings to work every morning is a reality that doesn't have an off switch. And she said, somebody knows something, please come forward. Not a press release, not a careful statement through a lawyer, a woman on live television, using whatever platform she has to beg someone, anyone, who knows something to say it out loud. I've thought about what it would take to do that. To sit on national television with that smile and that composure, day after day, while the investigation that's supposed to find your mother has been described by people close to it as administratively hamstrung, politically complicated, and frustratingly slow. There are now confirmed reports that the two main agencies on this, Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI, have had tensions behind the scenes from the beginning. That early mistakes were made, that the sheriff came out in the first days and told the public there was nothing to fear, essentially standing down, before anyone had any real idea what had happened. And that even 144 days in, some basic coordination between agencies apparently still isn't fully happening. Savannah Guthrie knows all of this. She's not naive. She works in news for a living. And she still gets up every morning and goes to work. And she looks for the moment to say, please, somebody knows something. So where does this actually stand? The investigation is active, according to Pima County. The FBI has the digital evidence, the Bitcoin wallet, the IP addresses, the forensic work. Pima County has the homicide investigation. A small task force of roughly 20 FBI agents and 5 Tucson homicide detectives is working it. 3 tips have pointed to a specific area near Nogales in the Mexican desert, including one that said, on a specific date in June, searchers were near Nancy's grave. A volunteer search group found 25 unmarked graves in that area. None of them were Nancy. There is a retired detective who spent a week in Tucson and believes the contact point between the suspect and this family runs through Annie's workshop and the people who pass through that neighborhood. There is a woman, apparently, who is trying to sell information to TMZ. And there is a second ransom note, from the same IP as the credible first note, that uses language so specific and so careful and so soft that former FBI agents are analyzing every word choice as a window into who wrote it. Buried with nature now. That phrase is going to mean something eventually. When investigators find Nancy, and I believe they will, that phrase is going to map onto a specific location. A creek, a tree line, a hillside. Something in the natural world that whoever wrote that note was pointing toward, without fully pointing to it. They knew where they put her. They chose language that described it. And somewhere in the gap between that description and an exact address is the break in this case that nobody has found yet. $1 million is waiting for whoever decides their conscience, or their greed, is worth more than their silence. If you know anything about this case, please call 1-800-CALL-FBI. The Guthrie family reward is $1 million. Let me know in the comments what you make of that second note. Does it read like a genuine communication from someone who was there? Or does something about the language feel off to you? Because I have a specific theory about who in that group wrote it, and I want to see if you're going to the same place.